In 845 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok was betrayed and left to die in the Arctic wasteland with nothing but his axe and the clothes on his back. What followed was 40 days of hell that would transform a Viking king into something beyond human, a legend who conquered death itself. This isn't just a story about survival. This is about how the Arctic wasteland became a forge that would temper a Viking king into something nature itself would fear. When man faces the ultimate test, only legends emerge. The expedition had seemed like destiny itself. Reports reached Kattegat of vast silver deposits hidden in the frozen lands beyond the known world, wealth that could fund armies, secure kingdoms, and establish dynasties for generations. Ragnar assembled his most trusted warriors, men who had followed him through countless raids and battles. They sailed north past the edges of the mapped world, into waters so cold that ice formed on their beards and their breath became visible clouds. But this expedition carried a secret darker than the Northern Nights, a conspiracy that would leave their king fighting for his life in the most hostile environment on Earth. What Ragnar didn't know was that his most trusted lieutenant, Bjorn the Red, had been planning this moment for months. The silver deposits were real, but so was Bjorn's ambition to claim them without sharing power with a king he believed had grown too comfortable, too soft. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Abandon Ragnar in the Arctic wasteland where nature would do what no enemy army had ever accomplished. No blood on their hands, no direct betrayal to answer for. Just a tragic accident in the frozen wilderness. They would return to Kattegat as the sole survivors of a doomed expedition, with rights to the silver and no king to challenge their claim. When Ragnar woke up alone in the endless white wasteland, his ship gone and his men vanished, he understood immediately what had happened. The bitter Arctic wind carried away his roar of rage as he realized that survival would require more than just Viking strength. It would require him to become something the Arctic had never seen before, a man who refused to die even when death was the only logical outcome. Legendary Vikings! Before Ragnar faces 40 days of Arctic hell, help us build the toughest warrior community on YouTube. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're fighting toward 100,000 survivors. Comment Arctic Warrior if you think you could survive even one day in Ragnar's frozen hell. Let's see how many true Vikings understand what real survival means. Ragnar Lothbrok stood alone in an endless white wasteland that stretched to every horizon. His long, blonde, braided hair was already stiffening with ice, his piercing ice-blue eyes watering from the brutal wind, his massive warrior frame beginning to feel the first bite of cold that would either kill him or forge him into legend. The temperature was beyond anything he had ever experienced, so cold that his breath froze into crystals before it could fully leave his lungs. The wind cut through his Viking wool like it was summer silk, and the ground beneath his feet was harder than castle stone. He had his battle axe, his knife, and the clothes he wore. Against the Arctic wasteland, it seemed laughably inadequate. Ragnar forced his tactical mind to work despite the shock of betrayal and the growing cold. His survival depended on honest assessment of his resources, not Viking bravado. Weapons. His legendary battle axe and a sharp knife, useful for hunting if he could find prey, for cutting if he could find materials, for fighting if something found him first. Clothing. Wool tunic, leather pants, fur-lined boots, designed for Scandinavian winters, not Arctic hell. Already insufficient against the killing cold. Knowledge. Decades of survival experience, but nothing like this. The Arctic played by different rules than any battlefield he had ever known. Time. Daylight was brief and precious. Every decision had to count, because mistakes in this environment weren't lessons. They were death sentences. The wind was strengthening, and Ragnar could feel his body temperature beginning to drop. He had perhaps hours before hypothermia would begin affecting his judgment, making every subsequent decision harder and more dangerous. Moving meant burning energy he couldn't spare, but staying meant freezing to death where he stood. He chose to move, following what looked like a ridge that might offer some protection from the wind. Each step through the deep snow required enormous effort. His boots began collecting ice, making walking treacherous, but moving generated heat, and heat meant life. The first rule of Arctic survival was becoming brutally clear. Everything was about managing energy and warmth. Waste either one, and the wasteland would claim another victim. After 2 hours of exhausting travel, Ragnar found what might save his life, a natural windbreak formed by massive ice formations that blocked the worst of the Arctic wind. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make survival possible for one night. Using his axe, he began the exhausting work of digging a shelter into the snowbank. Each swing required enormous effort in the thin air, but the alternative was freezing to death in his sleep. The shelter had to be just large enough for his body, with walls thick enough to provide insulation. Too large, and his body heat wouldn't warm the space. Too small, and he risked collapse. As darkness fell with terrifying speed, Ragnar crawled into his snow cave and faced his first night in hell. The cold was beyond description. Despite the shelter, Ragnar's body temperature continued dropping. He could feel hypothermia beginning its assault, his thinking becoming sluggish, his movements becoming clumsy, his body beginning to shut down non-essential functions. He forced himself to exercise in the cramped space, fighting to generate body heat. Push-ups, sit-ups, isometric muscle contractions, anything to keep his blood flowing and his core temperature stable. Sleep was impossible. The moment he relaxed, the cold would begin winning. He spent the night in a constant battle between exhaustion and hypothermia, between the need for rest and the need to stay alive. When dawn finally came, Ragnar Lothbrok was no longer just a Viking king. He was a man who had stared death in the face for 12 hours and refused to blink. Dawn revealed the true scope of Ragnar's challenge. The Arctic wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no obvious sources of food, water, or materials. The landscape was beautiful and absolutely lethal. His body was already beginning to consume itself. Without food, he had perhaps a week before starvation would join hypothermia as an enemy. Without water, even less. But he had survived the first night. That alone was more than his betrayers had expected. Now, he needed to transform from survivor to predator if he wanted to see Kattegat again. The hunt would begin today, because in the Arctic, you were either predator or prey. And Ragnar Lothbrok had never been prey in his life. On the third day, Ragnar discovered he wasn't alone in the wasteland. Wolf tracks in the snow revealed that a pack was hunting in the area, and they had found his scent. Arctic wolves were different from the wolves of Scandinavia. Larger, more desperate, and perfectly adapted to kill in the frozen wasteland. They hunted in coordinated packs and could track prey for days without rest. Ragnar realized his situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting the environment anymore. He was being hunted by predators who knew this terrain intimately. The rules of survival had changed. Now, he needed to think like both prey and predator simultaneously. Ragnar found a partially frozen stream and faced his first real test of Arctic hunting. Using his knife and Viking ingenuity, he attempted to fish through holes in the ice. The work was exhausting and the results meager, but every small fish represented life-saving calories and essential fat. His hands became numb and clumsy in the freezing water, but he forced himself to continue. After hours of effort, he'd caught enough small fish to provide one day's minimal nutrition. It wasn't enough to thrive, but it was enough to buy time while he planned his next move. The Arctic was teaching him patience and persistence on a level he had never needed before. On the fifth day, the wolves found him. 3 massive Arctic wolves approached his makeshift camp with the confidence of predators who had never met effective resistance. They were starving, desperate, and perfectly adapted for killing in the snow. Ragnar gripped his battle axe and prepared for a fight unlike any he had ever experienced. These weren't human enemies who could be intimidated or reasoned with. They were pure predators who saw him as food. The lead wolf attacked first, and Ragnar learned that combat in the Arctic required completely different tactics than battlefield warfare. Ragnar's axe found its mark, splitting the lead wolf's skull with a blow that echoed across the wasteland. The other wolves retreated, but the damage was done. They would be back with the full pack, but the dead wolf represented more than victory in combat. It was food, fur, tools, and psychological transformation. Ragnar had killed an apex predator in its own environment using nothing but Viking determination and tactical thinking. He spent the rest of the day efficiently processing the wolf carcass. The meat would provide desperately needed protein and fat. The fur would improve his insulation. The bones could become tools. Most importantly, he had discovered that the Arctic wasteland wasn't invincible. It could be fought, outsmarted, and conquered by someone with enough determination. Ragnar's axe found its mark, splitting the lead wolf's skull with a blow that echoed across the wasteland. The other wolves retreated, but the damage was done. They would be back with the full pack, but the dead wolf represented more than victory in combat. It was food, fur, tools, and psychological transformation. Ragnar had killed an apex predator in its own environment using nothing but Viking determination and tactical thinking. He spent the rest of the day efficiently processing the wolf carcass. The meat would provide desperately needed protein and fat. The fur would improve his insulation. The bones could become tools. Most importantly, he had discovered that the Arctic wasteland wasn't invincible. It could be fought, outsmarted, and conquered by someone with enough determination. 7 days in the wasteland had taught Ragnar lessons that no royal education could provide. The Arctic was a teacher that killed students who failed to learn quickly enough. Lesson 1. Energy conservation was everything. Every calorie burned had to serve a survival purpose. Lesson 2. The environment was actively trying to kill him. Complacency meant death. Lesson 3. He was stronger than he had ever imagined, but the wasteland was stronger still. By the end of week 1, Ragnar Lothbrok was no longer the same man who had been abandoned by his followers. He was becoming something the Arctic had never seen before, a human who refused to accept that the wasteland was unconquerable. Incredible Vikings! Ragnar just survived his first week in Arctic hell and killed a wolf pack leader. If this impossible survival amazes you, smash that like button. Drop a comment predicting how Ragnar will survive the next 33 days. What's your Arctic survival strategy? Share this epic survival story with warriors who need to witness true Viking endurance. The Wolfpack returned on day 10 with reinforcements. 7 wolves surrounded Ragnar's improved shelter, their hunger overcoming their fear of the human who had killed their leader. This wasn't a single combat encounter. This was siege warfare in the Arctic. The wolves could afford to wait, to probe his defenses, to attack when he was weakest. Ragnar had to maintain constant vigilance while conserving energy and staying warm. The siege lasted 3 days. Ragnar killed 2 more wolves, but the constant alertness and cold weather fighting pushed his body beyond its normal limits. He was burning through his energy reserves at an unsustainable rate. Victory came when he realized he could use the Arctic itself as a weapon, leading the wolves into a trap where the terrain worked in his favor. By week 3, Ragnar had transformed his original desperate snow cave into something approaching Arctic architecture. Using wolf bones, ice blocks, and salvaged materials, he built a shelter that could maintain livable temperatures even in the worst weather. The construction required engineering skills he had never known he possessed. Every joint had to be perfect, every wall precisely angled to trap heat while maintaining structural integrity. The improved shelter meant he could finally get real rest, which meant his body could begin recovering from the constant stress of survival. For the first time since his abandonment, Ragnar began to think beyond just staying alive to the next day. He began planning his eventual return to civilization. 3 weeks of desperate hunger had transformed Ragnar into something his enemies would never recognize, an Arctic predator who could track, trap, and kill with efficiency that matched any native hunter. He learned to read the subtle signs of prey movement in the snow, to construct traps that worked in sub-zero temperatures, to preserve meat in ways that maximize nutrition while preventing spoilage. His success rate improved dramatically as his understanding of Arctic hunting deepened. What had begun as desperate scavenging evolved into systematic predation. The Viking king was learning to thrive in conditions that should have killed him weeks ago. The isolation and constant stress should have broken Ragnar's mind, but instead, they forged it into something harder and more focused than ever before. He developed mental techniques for managing the psychological pressure of extended survival. He spoke aloud to himself, maintaining the human connection to language and complex thought. He planned elaborate strategies for his eventual return, keeping his mind engaged with problems beyond immediate survival. Most importantly, he never allowed himself to accept that the wasteland would defeat him. Every day he survived was proof that the Arctic could be conquered by sufficient determination and intelligence. His mind became as sharp as the ice around him, and twice as dangerous. By day 25, Ragnar had established something approaching a survival economy in the wasteland. He knew where to find food, how to preserve it, how to create tools from salvaged materials, and how to maintain his equipment in Arctic conditions. His shelter had evolved into a complex that included food storage, tool manufacturing areas, and defensive positions. He had created civilization's basic infrastructure, using nothing but intelligence and determination. The man who had been abandoned to die was now living better than many people in civilized settlements. He had turned the Arctic wasteland into his personal kingdom. 30 days of Arctic survival had changed Ragnar's body in ways that seemed almost supernatural. His metabolism had adapted to extreme cold. His reflexes had sharpened to predator levels. His endurance had expanded beyond normal human limits. His massive frame had become leaner, but somehow stronger. Every movement economical and purposeful. His ice-blue eyes had developed an intensity that seemed to cut through Arctic wind, like his gaze could cut through enemies. He was no longer quite the same species as the men who had betrayed him. The Arctic had forged him into something they would struggle to understand or defeat. On day 35, Ragnar made the decision that would transform his survival story into legend. He would not wait for rescue or hope for accidental discovery. He would walk out of the Arctic wasteland and return to civilization under his own power. The journey would require everything he had learned about Arctic survival applied to a moving expedition across unknown territory. He would have to carry enough resources to survive while traveling, navigate without landmarks, and maintain the energy needed for daily progress. It was the ultimate test of everything the wasteland had taught him. Ragnar began his trek south with equipment that would have seemed impossible 5 weeks earlier. He carried preserved food, Arctic-capable tools, and wore clothing enhanced with wolf fur and salvaged materials. His navigation relied on techniques learned through desperate necessity, reading weather patterns, understanding how wind and terrain interacted, following subtle signs that indicated direction and distance. Each day of travel required perfect energy management. Too much exertion meant exhaustion and death. Too little progress meant running out of supplies before reaching civilization. The Arctic tested every lesson he had learned, but now he was testing the Arctic in return. On day 38, the Arctic threw its final challenge at Ragnar. A blizzard so severe it should have been unsurvivable in the open. Wind speeds that could knock down a horse, visibility reduced to zero, temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Lesser men would have died in the first hour. Ragnar used techniques developed through 5 weeks of survival to create emergency shelter, maintain body heat, and wait out the storm without losing precious energy reserves. When the blizzard passed, he emerged not just alive, but stronger. The Arctic had played its final card, and he had survived it. After 39 days in the wasteland, Ragnar saw the first signs of human civilization: smoke from distant fires, tracks in the snow, the subtle changes in terrain that indicated settled areas. He approached the first settlement like a force of nature made human. His appearance was so changed by Arctic survival that the residents initially fled, thinking they saw some kind of ice demon or wilderness spirit. When they finally understood that this creature was actually a man, and not just any man, but the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, word spread like wildfire across the northern territories. News of Ragnar's survival spread faster than his actual travel toward populated areas. By the time he reached major settlements, crowds had gathered to see the man who had supposedly died in the Arctic wasteland. His followers had already returned, with stories of his tragic death in the frozen wilderness. They had mourned him, divided his property, and begun making plans that assumed he would never return. Ragnar's reappearance wasn't just survival, it was resurrection. The political implications would be as dramatic as the survival story itself. When Ragnar finally reached Kattegat, he was no longer simply a Viking king returning from an expedition. He was a man who had accomplished something previously considered impossible, surviving 40 days alone in the Arctic wasteland. The physical evidence of his ordeal was written on his body and in his eyes. This wasn't a story that could be fabricated or exaggerated. Everyone could see that he had been transformed by an experience beyond normal human endurance. He had become living proof that some humans could overcome any challenge through determination and intelligence. Legendary Vikings. Ragnar just conquered 40 days of Arctic hell and returned as something beyond human. If this impossible survival story amazed you, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Comment Arctic Conqueror to honor this incredible achievement. Share your thoughts. Could you survive even 1 week in Ragnar's frozen hell? Your support helps us bring more impossible survival legends to life. Bjorn the Red and his conspirators had spent 5 weeks enjoying the fruits of their betrayal, dividing Ragnar's wealth, making plans for their silver expedition, and establishing their version of what had happened in the Arctic. Ragnar's return shattered their reality like ice under summer sun. The man they had abandoned to die stood before them, transformed into something they barely recognized, but definitely feared. Their carefully constructed lies crumbled as everyone could see the physical evidence of Arctic survival written on Ragnar's body. There was no denying what he had endured or what he had accomplished. The political situation had reversed completely, and they were now the ones facing judgment. Ragnar's judgment of his betrayers was as cold and final as the Arctic wind. He had learned that survival required eliminating threats completely and efficiently. Mercy was a luxury that got you killed in the wasteland. The men who had condemned him to death by exposure would face exactly the same fate, but they would face it without the survival skills, mental preparation, or physical conditioning that had enabled his survival. Justice in the Arctic was simple. Those who would use the environment as a weapon should face that weapon themselves. Ragnar's survival had changed more than just his own capabilities. It had transformed how his entire kingdom viewed leadership, survival, and human potential. He had demonstrated that even the most impossible challenges would be overcome through determination and intelligence. His followers now served someone who had literally conquered death. The psychological impact on both allies and enemies was profound and permanent. Political relationships throughout the Viking territories shifted as everyone recognized that Ragnar Lothbrok was no longer just a successful raider, but a man whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. News of Ragnar's Arctic survival spread throughout medieval Europe, establishing him as a figure whose achievements bordered on the supernatural. Royal courts from England to Constantinople heard the story of the Viking king who had conquered the unconquerable wasteland. The survival story enhanced his reputation far beyond military achievements. Enemies began to fear him not just as a warrior, but as someone whose determination and intelligence could overcome any obstacle they might place in his path. He had become living proof that some humans possessed capabilities that others could barely imagine. The 40 days in the Arctic had permanently changed Ragnar in ways that went far beyond physical adaptation. He had discovered depths of determination and intelligence that he never knew he possessed. His approach to every challenge was now informed by the understanding that seemingly impossible obstacles could be overcome through systematic application of intelligence, patience, and absolute determination. The man who returned from the Arctic was not just a survivor. He was someone who had been forged in conditions that would have killed lesser men and emerged stronger than ever. Ragnar's survival techniques and mental approaches became legendary throughout the Viking world. His methods for Arctic survival were studied and adapted by explorers, warriors, and adventurers throughout medieval Europe. The story inspired countless others to push beyond their perceived limitations and attempt challenges they had previously considered impossible. The mental toughness and strategic thinking developed during Arctic survival enhanced Ragnar's military capabilities in ways that made him nearly unbeatable in conventional warfare. Enemies who had seemed formidable before his Arctic experience now appeared soft and predictable compared to the challenges he had already overcome. Ragnar's survival established new standards for what Vikings considered possible. The story became a cultural touchstone that inspired generations of Norse explorers and warriors to attempt previously unthinkable challenges. The Arctic survival became proof that human determination could overcome any environmental obstacle. From the frozen wasteland that should have been Ragnar's grave emerged eternal truth about human potential. No environment is unconquerable, no challenge insurmountable when faced with sufficient determination and intelligence. Ragnar Lothbrok had transformed from a Viking king into something beyond normal human achievement, a man who had stared death in the face for 40 days and made death retreat first. The Arctic wasteland had intended to claim another victim, but instead, it forged the greatest survival legend in medieval history. The frozen hell that was meant to be his tomb became the crucible that transformed him into something approaching a force of nature himself. In the end, the betrayers had accomplished exactly the opposite of their intention. Instead of eliminating a king they considered too comfortable, they had created a legend whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations. The man who walked out of the Arctic wasteland after 40 days was no longer just Ragnar Lothbrok. He was living proof that human determination could conquer any challenge the world could offer.